I signed the document in less than 5 minutes. 3 months later, I wasn't the founder anymore. Not fired, not bought out, not pushed, just erased, replaced by a version of the company I had built from nothing, a version that no longer had room for me in it. And the worst part? The instrument of my own removal was sitting right there on my desk the whole time. I had initialed every page. I had signed the last one with my full name in blue ink, the way I always did when I wanted something to feel official. I'm going to tell you this story the way it actually happened. Not the version I told investors when I was still trying to save face. Not the version I told my family when I didn't want them to worry. The real version. The one that starts with me being confident, competent, and completely wrong about the person sitting across from me. Because I think there are people watching this right now who are in the middle of a partnership they trust completely. And I think some of them are about to do exactly what I did. So let me take you back to the beginning. The company was called ArcLens. We built workflow automation software for mid-sized logistics companies. The kind of businesses that were too big to run on spreadsheets, but too small to afford enterprise solutions. There was a real gap in the market. I had found it by accident, working a consulting job straight out of grad school, watching operations managers manually enter data into 3 different systems that didn't talk to each other. I quit that job on a Tuesday, started coding on Wednesday. My name is Marcus. I'm not going to use my last name because this story involves real legal agreements, real professional consequences, and a real person who is still active in the industry. But everything I'm about to tell you is accurate. This is what happened. For the first 8 months, ArcLens was just me and a laptop in a 1-bedroom apartment. I wasn't sleeping enough. I was eating badly. I was also building the most exciting thing I had ever touched in my life. The product worked. Not perfectly, not at scale, but it worked. And when I put it in front of the first real operations manager who used it, she looked at me and said, "Where has this been?" That sentence carried me for months. But I was a technical founder. I could build. I could not sell, not really. I didn't understand enterprise sales cycles. I didn't know how to talk to CFOs. I had no network in logistics beyond the one company I had consulted for. I needed a partner. And that's when Daniel came into my life. I met Daniel at a startup mixer in the fall. He was polished in a way that I wasn't. Not fake polished, genuinely sharp. He had spent 6 years at a mid-market private equity firm, which meant he understood financial modeling, deal structure, and the psychology of institutional money. He could read a room. He remembered names. He knew how to make a potential client feel like the most important person in the conversation. We talked for 2 hours that night, then 2 more hours the following weekend. By the 3rd meeting, we were finishing each other's sentences about what ArcLens could be. He saw the same gap I saw. He had the relationships I didn't have. He was ready to go all in. Within 6 weeks, Daniel was my co-founder. We split equity 50-50. We put together a basic founder's agreement using a template we found through a startup legal resource online. We both hired the same attorney, which, I will tell you right now, was the first mistake. Not the last, but the first. The founder's agreement had standard vesting schedules. For years, 1-year cliff, monthly vesting after that. It had an IP assignment clause. It had a non-compete. What it didn't have, what I didn't think to ask for, and what our attorney didn't volunteer was a clearly defined for cause termination standard that protected both of us equally. I didn't know that mattered yet. I would learn. The next year was the best professional period of my life. Daniel closed our first 3 enterprise contracts. I built the integrations those clients needed. We hired 2 engineers and a part-time sales development rep. We moved into a co-working space. We started getting inbound interest from companies we hadn't even pitched. Revenue went from 0 to just over $800,000 ARR in 11 months. We started talking to investors. The investor conversations were exciting and exhausting in equal measure. Most VCs we talked to liked the product, but thought the market was too niche. A few wanted to see more traction. But one firm, I'll call them Meridian Ventures, was genuinely interested. They had a logistics-focused fund and a thesis that matched exactly what we were building. Their lead partner, a woman named Cecilia, had done 2 deals in adjacent spaces. She understood our customers. She asked the right questions. She pushed back on our projections in ways that made the projections better. By January of our second year, Meridian was ready to lead a $4.2 million seed round. This was real. This was the moment I had imagined while sitting alone in that apartment, eating cold rice and debugging API calls at 2 a.m. We were going to have capital. We were going to hire a real team. We were going to scale. I trusted Daniel completely at this point. He had earned that trust. He had delivered on everything he said he would deliver on. He was my partner in the fullest sense of the word. That trust is important for you to understand, because what happened next didn't feel like betrayal at the time. It felt like efficiency. The due diligence process with Meridian took about 6 weeks. During that time, Daniel managed most of the investor relationship while I worked with their technical team to answer questions about our architecture, security posture, and roadmap. It was a reasonable division of labor. 2 weeks before we were scheduled to close, Daniel came to my desk with a small stack of documents. "These are the updated governance docs," he said. "The attorneys put together a new founders agreement that incorporates the investor requirements. Standard stuff for a priced round. They want to see formal vesting acknowledgement, updated IP assignment, and a co-sale agreement. Cecilia's team needs them executed before we can finalize the cap table." He put them on my desk. He was calm. He was professional. He was in the middle of 3 other things. "I already signed my set," he added. "They just need yours." I want you to hold that moment with me for a second. Have you ever been handed a document and felt the subtle pressure of someone else's prior signature? It creates a momentum, a sense that the train is already moving and your job is to get on, not to ask where it's going. I was tired. We were 2 weeks from closing a $4.2 million round. I had been in technical sessions for 6 days straight. The document was presented as a formality, the legal wrapping around a deal that was already decided. I flipped through it. I saw familiar language. Vesting schedule, IP assignment, co-sale rights, drag-along provision, board composition. I saw my name. I saw the signature line. I signed it. I didn't read the for cause termination clause on page 31. I didn't notice that the definition of cause had been expanded from the original founders agreement. I didn't register that the board composition section had shifted majority approval rights in a way that made certain decisions possible without my vote. 5 minutes. Blue ink. Full name. The round closed 11 days later. For the first 6 weeks after closing, everything felt normal. We hired 2 senior engineers. We brought on a VP of sales with real enterprise experience. We opened a proper office. Daniel and I were in constant communication. The team was energized. But somewhere around week 8, I started noticing small things. Daniel began scheduling meetings with Cecilia that didn't include me. Not every meeting, most of them I was part of. But there were conversations happening that I heard about secondhand from our new VP of sales, who mentioned offhand that Daniel and Cecilia had been discussing a potential pivot toward a different vertical. I brought it up with Daniel directly. He was relaxed about it. "Just exploratory," he said. "Cecilia has a portfolio company in warehousing that might benefit from something adjacent to what we do. I didn't want to waste your time with something speculative." That made sense. Daniel often ran exploratory conversations before looping me in. That was part of how we had divided our work from the beginning. I let it go, but the meetings kept happening. Then, about 3 months after the close, our CFO, a part-time fractional hire, sent me a routine cap table summary. I almost didn't open it. When I did, I stared at it for a long time. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I understood it perfectly, and what it was showing me didn't match what I thought I had agreed to. Here's what I had believed going into the round. After the Meridian investment, Daniel and I would each hold approximately 35% of the company on a fully diluted basis. Meridian would hold roughly 22%. The remaining equity would cover the option pool and future hires. Here's what the cap table actually showed. I held 28.4%. Daniel held 35.1%. Meridian held 22.3%. The option pool and a new advisory equity reserve accounted for the rest. The gap between Daniel and me was 6.7 percentage points. That doesn't sound enormous. But in terms of decision-making leverage, in terms of alignment with the investor block, it was significant. I went back to the document I had signed. Page 14, Section 4.3, Equity Adjustments upon closing. There it was, a clause that allowed for equity reallocation based on a performance and contribution assessment conducted by the board in the 30 days prior to the round closing. The assessment had apparently determined that Daniel's contributions during the fundraising process warranted an additional equity grant, funded by a proportional reduction in my stake. The board at that time consisted of Daniel, one Meridian representative, and an independent director who had been appointed, I would later learn, at Daniel's suggestion, with Cecilia's approval, during the due diligence period. I had not been consulted. I had not voted. I had not even known the assessment was happening. Because under the new founders agreement, the one I had signed in 5 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon, I didn't need to be. Would you have caught that? If you were 2 weeks from closing a round you've been building toward for 2 years, exhausted and trusting the person who had been your partner through all of it, would you have read page 31? I want to ask that genuinely, not rhetorically, because I've asked myself that question hundreds of times since then, and I'm still not entirely sure the answer is yes. I asked Daniel to meet me for coffee away from the office. I had printed the cap table. I had printed the relevant pages from the founders' agreement. I was calm. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say. I wanted to give him the opportunity to explain before I assumed the worst. He was already there when I arrived. He ordered before I sat down. That small thing, the ordering before I sat down, landed strangely, like he knew the terrain of this conversation already. I put the documents on the table between us. I need to understand the equity adjustment, I said. He didn't flinch. He looked at the documents, then looked at me. I was going to bring this to your attention, he said. The timing wasn't great with the close, but the board felt it was necessary. The board that you effectively controlled at the time of that vote. Marcus, I managed the investor relationship through an 18-month process. Cecilia's team ran a real assessment. The independent director agreed. This wasn't personal. It's 6.7 points, Daniel. It's a reflection of contribution during a specific window. You presented that document to me as a formality. There was a pause. Not a guilty pause, a measured one. The pause of someone who had thought about this conversation before it happened. Everything in that document was accurate, he said. You had the opportunity to review it. You had legal counsel available. That was technically true. I had legal counsel available, the same attorney we both used, who had also prepared the document. I left the coffee meeting without resolution, without an apology, without anything that resembled the partnership I thought I had. 2 weeks after that conversation, I received a formal notice of a special board meeting. The agenda item was described as Founder Role Restructuring and Operational Leadership Review. I knew what was coming. I had spent 2 weeks talking to an independent attorney, finally, my own attorney, who had reviewed the full document package. Her assessment was not optimistic. The for-cause definition in this agreement is unusually broad, she told me. It includes a provision for removal based on material failure to meet performance expectations as defined by the board. That's not a legal standard. That's a subjective standard that the board controls. Can they use it? They can try. Whether it holds up is a different question, but litigation is expensive, slow, and public. And you're a minority shareholder under this agreement. I walked into that board meeting having accepted, on some level, what was going to happen. Not because I thought it was right, but because I had done the math and I understood that the leverage had already shifted before the meeting started. The boardroom was small. Daniel was there. Cecilia was there. The independent director was there. A man named Robert who had the affect of someone performing neutrality while having already made a decision. The meeting was formal, almost scripted. They presented a resolution to transition the CTO function to a new hire they had already identified. They noted that the founder agreement allowed for this restructuring under the board's operational authority. They offered me a retention package, a reduced equity stake, a nominal advisory title, and a 6-month consulting agreement. I was being bought out of my own company with my own equity. I asked to speak. I built this product, I said. Every line of the core architecture, every integration, every customer deployment. This company doesn't exist without the technical foundation I created. Cecilia nodded. She was not unkind. That almost made it worse. No one is disputing your contribution, Marcus. We're making a forward-looking decision about the leadership structure we need at this stage. At this stage. That phrase. I had heard it before in podcasts and case studies about founders being transitioned out of their own companies. I had always thought those stories were about people who weren't paying attention. I was paying attention. I just hadn't read page 31. The formal separation took another 3 weeks. My attorney negotiated some improvements to the retention package. We preserved a small equity stake, enough to matter if the company eventually exited at a significant valuation, not enough to give me any meaningful influence. The advisory title was window dressing. I used it for about 4 months before I stopped returning emails. The new CTO was hired within 60 days of my departure. He was competent. He restructured some of the technical architecture in ways that were reasonable given where the product was going. The company continued to grow. Last I heard, they were tracking toward a Series A. I don't spend time being angry about that. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's an expectation when you tell a story like this that you end it with bitterness or a revenge arc or some satisfying moment of the other person getting what they deserved. That's not this story. What I think about, instead, is the accumulation of small decisions that led to the outcome. The decision to share an attorney. The decision to trust a template over professional guidance. The decision to divide the investor relationship in a way that gave Daniel informational advantages I didn't register as significant. The decision to accept standard stuff as a sufficient description of a legal document. And the signature. 5 minutes. Blue ink. There's a version of this story where Daniel is the villain, where the whole thing was a calculated plan from the beginning, and I was always the mark. I don't know if that's true. I genuinely don't. What I know is that incentives are real, and that people, smart, capable, even fundamentally decent people, can rationalize decisions that serve their interests while framing those decisions as reasonable and fair. I don't think Daniel woke up on the day we met at that startup mixer and thought, I'm going to use this guy to build something and then remove him. But I think at some point during the fundraising process, he looked at the leverage available to him and decided to use it. And I had handed him that leverage with my own signature. There's a concept in law called constructive notice. The idea that you are legally considered to have known something if the information was available to you, regardless of whether you actually read it. Courts generally don't accept, I didn't read it, as a defense to a contract you signed. I signed a document that restructured my control of the company I founded. I signed it quickly. I signed it in the middle of a high-pressure process. I signed it because the person presenting it to me had earned my trust, and because trust can sometimes function as a substitute for due diligence, a substitute that feels warm and efficient right up until the moment it doesn't. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that reading the fine print felt like an insult to the relationship? That feeling is real. I understand it. I lived it. It's also the mechanism by which control changes hands in boardrooms and startups and partnerships every single year. I'm not here to give you legal advice. I'm not qualified to do that. And even if I were, your situation is different from mine. But I want to tell you the things I would have done differently. Not as a checklist, but as a mindset. First, a shared attorney is not your attorney. A lawyer who represents both parties in a negotiation cannot fully represent either party. When the interests of two people can potentially diverge, and in any business partnership, they can, you need your own counsel. Not because your partner is untrustworthy, because your partner is human, and so are you. Second, standard is a word people use to reduce your attention. There are standard elements in many legal documents. There are also non-standard elements embedded within standard documents that carry enormous consequence. The word standard is a sedative. It's designed to make you skim. Third, the moment someone says, "We just need your signature to close," is exactly the moment to slow down, not speed up. Closing urgency is real. It's also a well-documented psychological lever. The pressure of a closing timeline is not a reason to skip diligence. It is a reason to ask for 48 hours. Fourth, cap table literacy is not optional. If you are a founder, you need to understand your equity position, not just the percentage, but the conditions under which it can change. Dilution through funding rounds is expected and acceptable. Dilution through internal restructuring based on clauses you didn't fully understand is something else entirely. Fifth, and this is the one that took me the longest to sit with, trust is not a due diligence substitute. You could trust someone completely and still read the document. Those two things are not in conflict. If your partner is trustworthy, asking for time to review won't damage the relationship. If your partner responds to, "I want to read this carefully before I sign," with pressure, impatience, or hurt, that response is important data. I started a new company 14 months after leaving ArcLens. Different space, different structure, different everything. This time I have my own attorney. This time I read every document before I sign it, no matter how many times I'm told it's standard. This time I have a co-founder agreement that was drafted by counsel who represented me, not both of us. This time I know that loyalty and paperwork are different things. Loyalty is what you feel. Paperwork is what governs. And in the moment when those two things conflict, in a boardroom, in a cap table conversation, in a special meeting with a pre-written resolution, paperwork wins. Every time. I don't regret building ArcLens. I don't regret the 18 months of work, the product, the customers, the team we built. I'm proud of what that company became, even though I'm not part of it anymore. What I regret is the 5 minutes I spent on a document that deserved 5 hours. What I regret is confusing familiarity with safety. What I regret is signing my name, my full name, in blue ink on something I hadn't truly read. At what point does partnership become leverage? I think the answer is it becomes leverage the moment someone decides it is. And the only thing that limits that leverage is the clarity of your agreements. Not your relationship, your agreements. The relationship is what you build together. The agreement is what protects what you've built, including from each other.